For centuries, the most valuable knowledge on any ranch was the one the ledger books never recorded, the hands of the woman who knew which plants could save a dying herd. Her work was invisible, her name an afterthought. Until the day a desperate man, with nothing left to lose, traded his last horse for the one person everyone else had written off. This is the story of that trade and the hidden science that would decide its outcome. On one side, a man named Elias Thorne, his land cracked by drought and his hope nearly gone. On the other, a woman named Clara Reed, whose knowledge of plants was written off as mere folklore. Their fates met at a livestock auction in the summer of 1897, in a transaction everyone saw as charity and no one saw as salvation. Elias Thorne's ranch was dying by degrees. A third summer without meaningful rain had turned his 500 acres into a dust bowl. His prize herd of 40 Hereford cattle, the legacy of his father, was reduced to 19 gaunt animals, their ribs pressing against their hides like barrel staves. The bank in Cedar Fork had sent its final notice. The debt was $212. Elias had exactly one asset of negotiable value left: a 6-year-old draft horse named Bronson, the last animal he'd bred himself. The town of Cedar Fork saw his decline as a spectator sport. Men at the general store would fall silent when he entered, their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't, another one about to fold. The new agricultural agent, a man from the east with wireframe glasses, had told him the land was played out. The only modern solution was to sell to the railroad syndicate, buying up failing parcels. Elias refused. That land was his biography. Every fence post he'd sunk, every calf he'd pulled into the world on a freezing spring morning was a sentence written in soil and sweat. To sell was to erase himself. Meanwhile, in a cramped room above the town's only bakery, Clara Reed was being erased in a different way. At 34, she was considered a permanent burden. Her older brother, the baker, saw her as a drain on his household. Clara's crime was her mind. Since childhood, she'd been obsessed with the plants that grew in the harsh landscape. Where others saw weeds, she saw a pharmacy. She knew yarrow could clot a bleeding wound, that a poultice of crushed sage and beeswax could draw infection from a hoof abscess, that the bitter root of the Oregon grape could calm a colicky horse. But this was 1897. Science was men in laboratories, not women with dirt under their nails. Her knowledge was labeled old wives' tales. When she tried to help a neighbor's sheep suffering from bloat, recommending pennyroyal, the local veterinarian, a Dr. Albright publicly scoffed. Superstition, he called it, a danger to proper animal husbandry. That verdict stuck to her like a stain. She became the town's herb woman, a figure of pity and mild suspicion. Her brother's solution was to be rid of her. He arranged not a marriage, no one would have her, but an indentured placement. She was to be offered at the livestock auction, her skills listed as domestic labor. Cooking, sewing, cleaning, her true knowledge wasn't even worth mentioning. The day of the auction dawned hot and still. The air in the stockyard was thick with the smell of animal fear, hay, and human sweat. Elias led Bronson into the pennied area, the horse's coat brushed to a dull shine, a final act of respect. He avoided the eyes of other ranchers. Bids for work horses were low that year. He'd be lucky to get $30. It wouldn't be enough. Then the auctioneer, a man named Higgins with a voice like gravel, called a different lot. Next up, a different kind of utility, female 34 years, capable cook, competent seamstress, seeking a 1-year domestic contract, room and board included, opening bid $5. Clara was led to a small wooden platform. She wore a plain brown dress, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. She did not look at the crowd. The murmurs were not loud, but they were there. Reed's spinster sister heard she talks to plants. A few men chuckled. The bidding was lethargic. A boarding house owner offered $6. A rancher from the North Valley bid $7, needing a housekeeper for his bunkhouse. Elias wasn't even looking at her. He was calculating the hopeless math of his debt. But then, a fly bothered Bronson, and the horse shook his great head, his bridle jingling. The sound made Elias look up past the horse to the platform. He saw Clara, not the slump of her shoulders, but the way her eyes were fixed on a clump of mullein growing through a crack in the stockyard fence. He saw her lips move slightly, as if namming it. In that second, he didn't see a domestic servant. He saw a person who looked at a forgotten weed and saw something of value. It was a look he understood in his bones. The auctioneer called, going once at $7. Elias heard his own voice, rough from dust and disuse. 10. A ripple went through the crowd. $10 was high for an indentured domestic. The other rancher shrugged and bowed out. Higgins grinned. $10 it is, sold to Elias Thorne for the term of 1 year. The transaction took minutes. Elias handed over Bronson's lead rope to a buyer for $28. He then paid Clara's brother 10 of it. He was now down to $18 and a single piece of paper, a contract for a woman he didn't know. Her brother shoved a small cloth bag into her hands. "Your things," he said, not meeting her eye. It held a single change of clothes, a hairbrush, and a small, carefully wrapped bundle of dried plants tied with string. The ride to the Thorne Ranch was 5 miles of silence. Clara sat rigid on the wagon bench beside him, her bag on her lap. Elias pointed out nothing. The land did all the talking. They passed fences with missing posts, fields of gray, dead wheat, a creek bed that was only a scar of white stones. When the homestead came into view, it was a portrait of despair. The farmhouse's paint had long ago blistered away. The barn roof sagged. In the corral, a handful of cattle stood listlessly. He stopped the wagon. "This is it," he said, the words flat. Clara finally spoke, her voice low but clear. "The cattle have pink eye." Elias blinked. "What?" She pointed a slender finger. "The two by the trough, their squinting heads lowered. That's early pink eye. It spreads fast. It can blind them." Elias felt a spike of irritation. He'd lost a calf to it 2 years prior. "I know what it is," he snapped. "There's no money for the veterinary solution, the copper sulfate wash." Clara looked at him, then back at the animals. "You don't need copper sulfate," she said quietly. "You need Galax leaves." That was the first moment, the first crack in the reality he understood. He'd expected resignation, maybe tears. He hadn't expected a diagnosis and a prescription from a weed. He assigned her the small, cold room off the kitchen. Her duties, he stated, were the house and the meals. He showed her the near-empty pantry, sacks of beans, flour, a side of salted pork, some withered potatoes. He did not mention the cattle again. But that evening, as he did his rounds, he saw her walking the fence line, her skirt held in one hand, stopping here and there to examine a plant, sometimes picking a leaf and crushing it between her fingers to smell it. He pretended not to see. The first week was a disaster in the ways that mattered to him. She was a terrible cook. The beans were undercooked, the bread dense as clay. She moved through the dusty, quiet house like a ghost. They spoke only when necessary. The debt clock in his mind ticked louder. He began cataloging assets for a final, humiliating sale: his father's rifle, his mother's silver forks. Then 4 days after her arrival, the crisis he'd been dreading manifested. He found a prime heifer, one of his best, down in the south pasture. She was laboring to breathe, her belly distended, her legs kicking feebly at the air, bloat, often a death sentence. It could kill within hours. The conventional treatment was a trocar, a sharp tube to puncture the stomach and release the gas, a risky procedure he wasn't skilled enough to perform. Dr. Albright's fee was $5 he didn't have, and the vet was a day's ride away. Elias sank to his knees in the dirt beside the suffering animal, a wave of utter defeat washing over him. This was it. The loss of this heifer would break the fragile back of his operation. He heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn. Clara's voice was calm. "It's frothy bloat. From the clover she's been grazing. She needs the foam in her stomach broken down." Elias looked up, despair turning to anger. "I know what she needs. I don't have the oil, I don't have the tools." "You have lard in the pantry," Clara said, "and you have pennyroyal. It's growing by the well pump." She didn't wait for permission. She turned and hurried back to the house. Elias stayed with the heifer, his hand on her neck, feeling her panicked heartbeat. This was madness. He was listening to a woman the town called a crank, about to risk a valuable animal on a handful of mint. Clara returned with a tin cup. In it was a lump of melted lard mixed with a paste of crushed, pungent green leaves. "We need to get her to swallow this," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It took both of them, Elias forcing the heifer's head up, Clara working the oily herbal mixture over the back of its tongue. The animal coughed, snorted, but finally swallowed. Then they waited. The sun climbed. For 20 agonizing minutes, nothing changed. Elias cursed himself for his stupidity. Then a deep, resonant rumble came from the heifer's gut. She let out a long, relieved belch. The tight drum of her belly began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. Within an hour, she struggled to her feet, shook herself, and took a tentative bite of grass. Elias stared, then turned to Clara. She was wiping her hands on her apron, her expression unreadable. The question that had been simmering since the auction now boiled over. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara met his gaze. "I'm the person you traded your last horse for," she said, "and if you want this ranch to live, you need to start listening to me." But trust, especially for a man who trusted only what he could break or buy, would not come easily. And the first test of that fragile, desperate alliance was already creeping toward them from the darkened barn. A new plague, one that conventional medicine said was unstoppable, and that would force Clara to prove her knowledge wasn't just luck, but a science everyone else had forgotten. The plague was called hoof rot, and it moved through the remaining herd like a silent curse. It started with a slight limp, then a softening of the hoof, a foul smell, and finally an animal that could no longer stand to feed. Elias had seen it before. It was considered a death sentence for isolated ranchers. The veterinary manual recommended isolation and a solution of formalin, a chemical he couldn't afford and didn't possess. Within a week, 3 of his 19 cattle were showing signs. He found Clara in the overgrown kitchen garden, methodically pulling what looked like common weeds and laying them in a basket. "It's in the south pasture now," he said, his voice tight. "The rot." She didn't look up. "I know. I saw the bull favoring his left front this morning. Albright's book says there's nothing to be done without the proper chemicals." Clara finally straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dr. Albright's book was written in Boston. It doesn't know what grows here." She pointed to a vigorous plant with broad, dock-like leaves. "This is Usnea. It's a lichen. It grows on the north side of the old oaks by the creek. And this," she said, touching a spiky, low-growing herb, "is creeping Mahonia. The root is yellow like turmeric. Together with some pine tar, they make a poultice that draws out the infection." Elias felt the familiar war inside him, ingrained skepticism against desperate hope. "A poultice. You want to treat a bacterial rot with a mud paste. I want to treat it with an antiseptic and an astringent that this land provides for free," she corrected, her tone clinical. "We need to gather the materials now." Afternoon was a turning point, not in the ranch's fortune, but in their fragile dynamic. He followed her instructions. He chopped Usnea from the oaks. He dug for the tough, gnarled roots of the Mahonia. Their vibrant yellow caught a shock of color in the gray earth. Clara worked at the kitchen table, grinding the roots into a powder, steeping the lichen in boiled water to create a dark, tea-like infusion. She mixed it with a small, precious jar of pine tar he'd used for waterproofing boots. The treatment was labor-intensive. They had to rope each infected animal, throw it, clean the foul hoof with vinegar, and pack the pungent, dark poultice deep into the softened cleft, binding it with clean cloth. The cattle lowed in protest. The work was filthy, exhausting, but they did it together, a wordless assembly line of shared urgency. For 3 days, Elias expected failure. He checked the treated hooves every morning, anticipating worsening decay. Instead, on the 4th day, the foul smell began to fade. The angry, inflamed flesh around the hoof was receding, turning dry and pink. The bull was putting weight on his foot. It wasn't a miracle cure. It was slower than a chemical might have been, but it was working. The infection was retreating. This quiet, tangible evidence did what words never could. It opened a door. Elias stopped merely tolerating her presence and began, hesitantly, to observe her process. He watched her walk the pastures not as a daydreamer, but as a surveyor. She noted which areas the cattle avoided and discovered patches of milkweed, which she explained could cause cardiac distress if eaten in quantity. She pointed out healthy stands of bunchgrass that had survived the drought better than others, suggesting they collected seed. She transformed the neglected kitchen garden, not with vegetables from a catalog, but with a strategic pharmacy: echinacea for immune support, comfrey for wound healing, lavender to repel flies from the chicken coop. One evening, over a now edible stew, she spoke unprompted. My grandmother was Metis, she said, staring into the fire. From the Red River, the bison hunters and the settlers, they came to her. She knew how to treat saddle sores with buffalo berry, how to use wild mint for a settler's child's fever. She taught my mother, who taught me. This knowledge, it's not magic. It's observation passed down over thousands of seasons. It's just that the people who wrote the books never bothered to ask the people who lived here. Elias was silent for a long moment. And the doctors in town, Albright. They see the land as something to conquer, she said simply. My grandmother saw it as a partner. You don't conquer a partner, you learn its language. This philosophical shift began to manifest in practical economic terms. The ranch's bleeding slowed, then stopped. No more animals were lost. The treated ones recovered. The preventative sprays Clara made from garlic and wild rosemary seemed to keep flies and ticks at bay, which meant less stress and better weight on the cattle. For the first time in a year, Elias saw a path that didn't end at the bank's foreclosure desk. But the outside world had not forgotten them. A month after the hoof rot crisis, a polished buggy pulled up to the ranch. Out stepped Dr. Horace Albright, accompanied by the bank manager, Mr. Greeley. Their faces were masks of polite concern. Elias, Greeley began, avoiding eye contact with Clara, who stood in the doorway. We've come to assess the situation. The bank is naturally concerned, given the outstanding note. Albright, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with clinical disdain, chimed in. I also heard you had an outbreak of foot rot. A terrible business. I have the proper treatment in my bag if you'd like to purchase it. On credit, of course. Elias felt the old shame rising, but then he looked at Clara. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. He found his voice. The foot rot's been handled, doctor, thank you. Albright's eyebrows shot up. Handled, with what, pray tell? With a poultice, Elias said, the word feeling strange but solid in his mouth. A poultice, Albright repeated, a smirk playing on his lips. Of mud and wishes, I suppose. You do realize you're risking your entire herd, and by extension, the bank's collateral on superstition. Greeley shifted uncomfortably. Elias, perhaps it's best to listen to expert advice. It was Clara who moved forward then. She walked past the men, straight to the corral where the once lame bull now stood, solid and healthy. Without a word, she picked up the animal's front hoof, holding it up for inspection. The hoof was hard, clean, and whole. The evidence was irrefutable. Albright's smirk vanished. He strode over, examining the hoof himself, his professional curiosity momentarily overriding his contempt. This is remarkable healing. What was in this poultice? Usnea mahonia root, pine tar, Clara stated, as if listing common ingredients. The veterinarian stared at her, then at the hoof, his scientific mind grappling with a result that contradicted his textbook. I would need to see this documented, tested. You could start by looking, Clara said, then turned and walked back to the house. The visit ended awkwardly. Greeley, confused but seeing healthy cattle, mumbled about a short extension. Albright left in a flurry of muttered notes in his ledger, but the victory was brittle. They had attracted the wrong kind of attention. The rumor mill in Cedar Fork began to grind. The story warped as it traveled. Thorne's witch woman cured his cows with devil's weeds. She's got that Metis magic. The slight respect Elias had begun to earn curdled into suspicion. When he went to town for supplies, he was met with cold shoulders and averted glances. Then the true escalation came. It wasn't from nature or the bank, but from human malice. One morning they found a crude symbol painted on the barn door, a twisted circle, a hex sign. That same night, a rock came through the kitchen window, wrapped in a note that read, "Send the Indian medicine back." Elias was furious, ready to ride into town and confront everyone. Clara was eerily calm. Fear makes people stupid, she said, sweeping up the glass. They're afraid of what they don't understand, and now they're afraid my way might actually work. That's a more dangerous thought to them than any disease. But the vandalism was just a precursor. The real blow fell from an official letter delivered by the county sheriff. It was a notice of complaint filed with the Regional Livestock Board, citing unapproved and potentially hazardous medical treatments being administered to commercial livestock on the Thorne Ranch. The The complaint was signed by Dr. Horace Albright in his capacity as a certified veterinary advisor. The ranch was to be inspected. If found in violation, the county could quarantine his herd, effectively destroying their value. Elias read the notice, his hands trembling not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying rage. The battle was no longer against drought or disease. It was against the very establishment that was supposed to support him. They weren't just trying to take his land now, they were trying to criminalize the knowledge that was saving it. He handed the letter to Clara. She read it, her face pale. "They can't quarantine healthy animals," she whispered. "They can do whatever they want," Elias said, his voice low and firm. "They have the certificates on the wall. We have." He gestured to the garden, the jars of dried herbs. "We have this." He looked at her, the woman he'd bought for $10, who had become the improbable architect of his survival. "You said I needed to listen to you, so tell me, Clara Reed, what do we do now? Because if they shut us down, we lose everything, and I will not let them take what you've built here." Clara met his gaze, the quiet herbalist gone, replaced by a strategist. "Then we don't give them a reason to shut us down," she said. "We give them proof they can't ignore. We have to beat them at their own game. But to do that, I need to show you something. Something I haven't told anyone, not even my brother." The secret she revealed next would change everything, turning their desperate defense into a shocking counterattack that Dr. Albright and the livestock board would never see coming. Clara led him not to the garden, but to her small, sparse room. From beneath the narrow bed, she pulled out a wooden box, its surface worn smooth from handling. Inside was not jewelry or letters, but a stack of handmade notebooks, their pages filled with dense, meticulous script. "My grandmother's journals," Clara said, her voice hushed. "And mine, every treatment, every plant used. The dosage, the method of preparation, the symptoms before, and the observed results after. For 30 years, across 2 generations." Elias slowly took one of the books, its pages brittle. He couldn't read all the words, some were in a language he didn't know, others were detailed botanical drawings, but he could understand the careful columns of dates and outcomes. Here was a record of a horse with strangles, treated with a sage infusion, recovered in 7 days. There, a cow with milk fever, given a tincture of raspberry leaf and dandelion, back on her feet in 2. It wasn't anecdote, it was data. "This is it," he breathed. "This is what you've been hiding." "I wasn't hiding it," Clara corrected softly. "I was protecting it. To men like Albright, this is just a woman's scribbling. They dismiss it, or worse, take it and claim the knowledge as their own. But now it's a weapon. We have documented proof that these methods work." The plan formed that night, fueled by a shared, quiet fury. They would not wait passively for the inspection. They would preempt it. They would turn their ranch into a living exhibit. Clara would compile her most clear-cut case studies from the journals, focusing on the recent hoof rot and bloat cases, translating the traditional knowledge into terms a board of officials might grudgingly understand. Elias would handle the animals, ensuring every single one was in visibly prime health, walking proof that the unapproved treatments caused no harm. For the next week, they worked with a frenetic, focused energy. Clara created clean, simplified transcripts of the relevant journal entries. Elias groomed the cattle until their coats shone, repaired fences, and whitewashed the barn, presenting an image of order and prosperity. They were preparing for a trial. The day of the livestock board inspection arrived under a bleak gray sky. 3 men came: the county commissioner, a stern man named Pritchard, Dr. Albright, wearing a smug, professional demeanor, and a third, younger man who was the official scribe. They moved through the ranch like auditors, their eyes missing nothing. Pritchard began with blunt authority. "Mr. Thorne, the complaint states you are using non-standard, potentially dangerous substances on food animals. This is a serious violation of herd health protocols. What is your response?" Elias, standing straight, gestured to Clara, who stood nearby with a folder of papers. "My response is that the treatments used here are safe, effective, and documented. We have cured hoof rot and bloat without expensive chemicals. The herd is healthy. You can see for yourself." Dr. Albright stepped forward. "Documented by whom? By her," he said, nodding dismissively at Clara. "A collection of folk tales is not veterinary science. Where are your controlled studies, your peer reviews?" Clara didn't flinch. She opened her folder. Here are the case records, dates, symptoms, botanical preparations applied, and daily progress notes. For the bull with hoof rot, treated on June 4th. Observe him now. She pointed to the animal standing solidly in the corral. Albright examined the bull, his clinical eye unable to deny the healed hoof. But his pride was a fortress. Correlation is not causation, Miss Reed. The animal could have improved on its own, without isolating the variable. The variable was my poultice, Clara interrupted, her tone cooler than the morning air. And when 3 of your clients' herds were struck with the same rot last year, doctor, and you charged them for formalin that only slowed the spread, what was their recovery rate? Would you like to compare my documented outcomes with yours? A silence fell. Albright's face flushed. He had not expected to be challenged on his own results. Commissioner Pritchard cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Be that as it may, the regulations are clear. Only approved treatments listed in the Veterinary Codex are legal for use on commercial livestock. Your herbs are not listed. Therefore, their use is illegal. We have no choice but to issue a quarantine notice pending a full review, which could take months. Elias felt the ground fall away. They had proof, they had results, and it didn't matter. The law was a wall, and they were on the wrong side of it. Months, my animals will be unsellable, the bank will foreclose. It is the price of operating within the law, Mr. Thorne, Pritchard said, not unkindly, but with finality. The scribe began writing the official notice. It was at this moment of crushing defeat that the wait, it gets worse moment arrived. The sound of a galloping horse broke the tension. A young ranch hand from the neighboring spread, the Bar V, skidded to a halt, his face pale with panic. Doc Albright, you gotta come, it's hit our herd. Dozens of them just went down, shaking, frothing at the mouth. Mr. Vance is fit to be tied. Albright snapped to attention, his professional duty overriding the confrontation. What are the symptoms? Exactly. The hand gulped. They're trembling, staggering, some are convulsing. It's like they're drunk, but they ain't had nothing. A cold, shocking realization dawned on Clara's face. She knew this. She turned to Elias, speaking rapidly, too low for the others to hear. Locaweed, it's early season locaweed. They must have broken into the North Draw where it grows. It causes neurological damage. There's no conventional antidote. It's fatal in 70% of cases. Albright was already heading for his buggy. Lead the way. I'll need my arsenic solutions. Try to flush their systems. His voice trailed off, the uncertainty clear even to him. Arsenic treatment was risky and often as deadly as the poison itself. Commissioner Pritchard looked from the retreating veterinarian to Elias and Clara, the quarantine notice half-written in his scribe's hand. A massive, expensive disaster was unfolding on a major ranch nearby. The political and economic fallout would be severe. Clara saw the calculation in his eyes. She made the gamble of her life. Commissioner, she said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet yard, I know what this is, and I have a treatment. It's not in the codex, but I have my grandmother's notes on it from 1872 when it wiped out half a Sioux pony herd. We can save those animals, but you have to let us try. Pritchard stared at her. You're asking me to authorize an unapproved treatment on a mass scale during an official investigation of you for using unapproved treatments. No, Clara said, a fierce light in her eyes. I'm asking you to prevent an economic catastrophe for this county. Let me prove it right now. Let the results be the evidence. The commissioner was trapped. The rules said one thing. A potential disaster screamed another. He looked at Elias. Thorne, you back this. Elias didn't hesitate. He looked at Clara, the woman who had turned weeds into hope. With everything I have. Pritchard made a decision. He tore the half-finished quarantine notice from the scribe's book. Go, both of you. If you fail, the consequences will be tenfold. But if you succeed, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What followed was a frantic race against time. They rode to the Bar V, a much larger, richer spread than Elias. In a vast pasture, over 30 prime cattle were already showing severe symptoms, head tremors, clumsy staggering, some lying on their sides, legs kicking at the air. The owner, a formidable man named Vance, was shouting at his helpless hands. When he saw Elias and Clara with the commissioner, he roared, "What is this?" I called for Albright. "Albright's on his way with arsenic," Pritchard said. "She says she has an alternative." Vance looked Clara up and down with pure contempt. "The herb witch, you bring her onto my land, get out." It was Clara who walked past him, straight toward the nearest stricken cow. She examined its eyes, felt its pulse, smelled its breath. "It's locoweed confirmed," she announced. "We need to move fast. The treatment requires activated charcoal burned toast, ground to powder, and a strong tea made from the leaves of the red maple tree. It binds the toxin and supports the liver. We need buckets of it. Now." Something in her absolute certainty pierced Vance's panic. He was a businessman facing the loss of thousands of dollars. "You've done this before?" he demanded. "My grandmother has. It's in her notes. We have maybe 4 hours before the neurological damage becomes permanent." Vance swore, then bellowed at his men. "You heard her. Burn every damn loaf of bread in the cookhouse. Strip the maple grove by the creek. Move." What unfolded was a surreal, all-hands battlefield clinic. Clara directed operations with a commander's calm. Elias and the ranch hands worked to gently drench each affected animal with the dark, gritty charcoal slurry and the maple leaf tea. It was messy, exhausting, and utterly unconventional. Dr. Albright arrived with his case of chemicals, took one look at the scene, and stood frozen in disbelief, then in growing, silent observation. They worked until dusk. As the sun bled red over the hills, the violent tremors in the first treated animals began to subside. The staggering became less pronounced. The cows, exhausted, lay down not in convulsions, but to sleep. Vance, who had watched with his fists clenched for hours, approached Clara, his earlier fury gone, replaced by a stunned awe. "They're calming down," he muttered. "By God, they're calming down." Clara, her dress stained with charcoal and mud, simply nodded. "They'll need the tea for 3 more days, and you'll have to clear that north drawer of the locoweed." Vance looked from her to Commissioner Pritchard. "Forget the quarantine, Pritchard. You try to shut this woman down, you'll have to answer to me and every rancher from here to the county line." The commissioner had seen all he needed to see. The law was black and white, but the results were undeniable. He turned to Dr. Albright, whose professional arrogance had deflated into shocked contemplation. "Doctor, your professional opinion now that you've witnessed it." Albright was quiet for a long time. He finally spoke, not to the commissioner, but to Clara. "The maple leaf, Acer rubrum, there are studies emerging from Europe on its glycosidic properties for circulatory issues. You used it as a hepatic support." It was the first time he had addressed her as a fellow practitioner. Clara nodded. "The charcoal binds. The maple helps the liver process what slips through." Albright let out a long breath. He looked at the recovering animals, then at his unused arsenic bottles. "Commissioner," he said, his voice formal, "I withdraw my complaint, and I recommend the Livestock Board create a new provisional category for documented ethnoveterinary practices pending further study." It was a complete and utter surrender. The victory was monumental, but as Elias and Clara rode home in the dark, the adrenaline fading, a new and profound tension settled between them. They had won the war. The ranch was saved, her methods legitimized, but the transaction that had brought them together, the $10 indenture, now hung in the air like a ghost. Her contract had only months left. She was no longer a purchased servant, but the celebrated savior of the valley. She had a world of options now. And he had nothing left to offer her but a hard-won patch of dirt and a heart he was suddenly terrified to name. He had gotten everything he'd fought for, and in the process, he was about to lose the only thing that had made the fight worthwhile. The final challenge would not be against nature, or the bank, or the law. It would be against the unspoken terms of their own beginning, and whether something born in a dusty stockyard could ever be called love. The silence on the ride home was louder than any argument. The victory over the locoweed, the vindication from the Livestock Board, it all rang hollow against the unspoken truth hanging between them. Clara's contract would expire with the autumn leaves. She was no longer an indentured woman, but a respected healer. Ranchers would pay for her knowledge now. She had her freedom, and Elias had nothing but a debt-free deed and a crushing sense of impending loss. The next weeks were study in quiet agony. The ranch flourished. The second cutting of hay was the best in years. The The cattle, robust and healthy, would fetch a premium at the fall market. The bank, hearing of the events at the Bar V, not only forgave the remaining interest, but offered a line of credit. Elias had won, but the house felt emptier than it ever had during the drought. He watched Clara. She was often deep in her journals, transcribing, organizing. He assumed she was preparing to market her services. The thought was a physical pain. One evening, he found her at the kitchen table, not with her journals, but with a piece of paper and a pencil, sketching. It was a detailed layout of the garden, but expanded, with sections labeled for different soil types, sun exposure, and companion plantings. "Planning your next garden?" he asked, trying to sound casual, the words sticking in his throat. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Planning the garden, this one, for next spring, assuming I'm here to plant it." The air left his lungs. He stared at her. You want to stay?" Clara set the pencil down. "Elias, you traded your last horse for me. You defended me to the bank, to the livestock board, to a mob. You gave my grandmother's knowledge a home when my own family called it worthless. This land," she gestured out the window, "it remembers what we did for it. It's my home, but I won't stay as a servant, and I won't stay out of pity." He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his. They were the hands that had saved everything he loved. "Clara Reed," he said, his voice raw, "the only pity is that it took me so long to see you, not the herbalist, not the miracle worker. I don't want a servant, I don't need a healer. I'm asking the woman I love to please build a life with me here, as my partner, as my wife, if she'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, a true, radiant smile that transformed her face. "I thought you'd never ask," she whispered. Their wedding was not in town, but under the old oak at the edge of the garden. The guests were the neighboring ranchers they'd helped, the hands who had worked beside them, and Dr. Albright, who came not as a critic, but as a curious colleague, bearing a book on botanical pharmacology as a gift. Vance from the Bar V stood as Elias' best man. There was no talk of purchases or contracts, only promises. The partnership they forged was formidable. Clara's understanding of the land dovetailed with Elias' husbandry. She identified native grasses that required less water and were more nutritious, gradually reseeding the pastures. She created a small, profitable sideline drying and selling her medicinal herbs and simple remedies to other homesteads, with clear instructions pennied in her neat hand. The Thorn Ranch and Botanicary became a local institution. But the final, surprising twist was not in their success, but in its reach. 3 years after their marriage, a letter arrived from the Territorial Agricultural College. Dr. Albright, it turned out, had been quietly corresponding with a professor there. He had submitted Clara's carefully documented case studies, the hoof rot, the bloat, the locoade incident, anonymously. The college, facing its own challenges with livestock diseases in arid territories, was intrigued. They invited the practitioner to consult. Clara, with Elias at her side, traveled to the college. She stood before a room of skeptical academics and presented her grandmother's journals and her own editions not as magic, but as a systematic, observational science. She spoke of dosages, of preparation methods, of seasonal variations in plant potency. She presented the healed animals not as miracles, but as data points. The result was not an immediate revolution, but a crack in the wall. The college established a small, funded research project to formally study the most promising ethnoveterinary practices. They hired Clara as a consulting field researcher. For the first time, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women was given a ledger line in an official budget. The ranch became a living research station. Botanists from the college would visit, walking the pastures with Clara, learning to see the land not as a blank slate for industrial agriculture, but as a complex, pre-existing pharmacy. Elias, once the student, became the translator, bridging the gap between academic language and the practical realities of ranch life. They never got rich in the traditional sense, but they built a legacy of abundance. The garden Clara had sketched at the kitchen table grew into a thriving, multi-acre showcase of sustainable dryland farming and medicinal cultivation. They taught workshops. They fostered orphaned children from the territory, giving them a home and an education in both book learning and land wisdom. Years later, long after the railroad had indeed come through, but routed around their hill at a steeper cost, just as Elias had predicted, an elderly Clara sat with her eldest foster daughter on the porch. The girl was reading from a newly published book, Flora Medica of the Western Territories. The author was listed as the Territorial Agricultural College, but the dedication page read, "For Clara Reed Thorne, whose eyes taught us to see." Clara listened, her gnarled hand resting on the head of a sleeping dog, her eyes on Elias, who was showing a young grandchild how to check a horse's hoof. The trade that had begun in desperation had yielded a harvest they could never have calculated, a life built not on conquest, but on collaboration, a love that grew not at first sight, but from the slow, sure recognition of true worth in another human being. And a plot of earth that had been saved, in the end, by the very thing everyone had once tried to throw away. The story of the horse traded for a woman was now a fireside tale in the valley. But the real story, the one that mattered, was the one written in the resilient green of the garden, in the healthy herds, and in the quiet, enduring partnership that proved the most valuable thing you can ever acquire is not land or livestock, but someone who sees the same future in the same patch of dirt, and chooses, every day, to build it with you. So the ledger books were wrong. The most valuable asset on the Thorne Ranch was never listed on any balance sheet. It was the knowledge in Clara Reed's hands, a living library passed from her grandmother, waiting for someone desperate enough to look past the price tag and see the person. Their story is a single, vivid thread in a much larger tapestry that we are only now beginning to properly appreciate. For millennia, across every culture, it was women like Clara who were the first botanists, the first pharmacists, the first veterinarians. They sustained communities with knowledge gained through observation and necessity, long before the institutions that would later dismiss them even existed. Today we face our own set of crises, in agriculture, in medicine, in our relationship with the environment. We spend fortunes on technological solutions, often overlooking the fact that some of the most powerful answers have been growing quietly at the edges of our fields all along. The story of Elias and Clara is more than a historical romance. It is a case study in a different way of seeing value. It asks us what and who we might be overlooking in our own pursuit of quick fixes and conventional wisdom. What traditional knowledge is being lost in your own family or community? What potential is hidden in plain sight, dismissed because it doesn't come with a certificate or a corporate logo? The legacy of the Thornes tells us that resilience often doesn't look like a bulldozer. It looks like a woman in a worn dress, bending down to examine a weed, understanding that within it lies the secret to saving what everyone else has given up for dead. Their ranch is gone now, absorbed by time, but the principle they proved remains. Sometimes, the trade that looks the most foolish in the moment, the last horse for the unwanted woman, is the one that history remembers as the beginning of everything, because it wasn't a transaction of goods. It was an investment in a different kind of future, one built not on what you take, but on what you are finally willing to see. If you found this story of hidden potential and resilience compelling, there are countless other tales waiting to be told of forgotten skills and unlikely saviors. Subscribe and join us as we keep unearthing them.